welcome to the Publishing Performance Show, the podcast that helps self-published authors turn their passion into a profit. Now, I'm your host, Teddy Smith, and if you're serious about building a sustainable business, then you're in the right place. Every week, I sit down with successful authors, industry experts, and publishing professionals who share their exact strategies they use right now to how they've grown their business, grow their readership, increase their book sales, and essentially to make a bit more money. Now, whether you're just starting out or you're looking to scale your existing publishing business, you'll walk away from every episode with actionable insights you can implement immediately. Now, if you're new here, it would really help me out if you could subscribe either on Apple or Spotify or YouTube or wherever you are. Just simply hit the subscribe button. It really helps the show to get more reach, which means we can get better guests for you and we can help you out in more ways. All right, let's dive into this episode. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Publishing Performance Show. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Matty Dalrymple, who is a best-selling author and the host of the Indy Author Podcast. So thank you very much for joining us, Matty.
Oh, it's fun to be here. I'm glad we're having a follow-up to our conversation at Author Nation.
Yeah, it was. Did you enjoy Author Nation?
That was fantastic. Yeah, I can't believe that team of people pulled off what was basically like the first time for that conference. I know, many of the things carried forward from 20 books, but they made some significant changes, and I thought they did a fabulous job, and it's like a networking dream come true. So yeah, I had a wonderful time.
Yeah, it was good. I mean, for anyone who doesn't, if you've been listening to my shows, you'll know what Author Nation is, but for people who haven't, it's a really big conference in Las Vegas, and it's basically where everyone from the indie author world gets together to talk about books and how to sell more books and how to be better at writing and all those sort of things. Basically, the entire self-publishing industry is there to talk about self-publishing. It's great, wasn't it? Yeah. And so when we were there, you were actually giving a talk all about podcasting for authors. And I think that's what we want to talk about today, because I get a lot of questions about how can I come on the show? Like, what's my criteria? What do I need to prepare? How can I appear on more shows? Where do I find shows? All these sort of questions. So why don't you give us a bit of a background to how we've ended up speaking today? Like, what do you do and how do you help authors?
Yeah, well, I am a fiction author. I have two series, the Ann Kinnear Suspense novels and the Lizzy Ballard thrillers. And I also write, speak, podcast, and consult on the writing craft and the publishing voyage as the Indy author. That's Indy with a Y, I-N-D-Y. And so I have just coming up on 270 episodes of the Indy Author Podcast, which has been out there since 2016. It started out, and I think this is actually useful for people to hear, like what the impetus was of me starting a podcast, which was basically that I belong to a local writers group. I live outside Philadelphia. I belong to the Brandywine Valley Writers Group. There were a couple of people in that group who had, specific areas of expertise that I was interested in learning more about. So one of them understood about media outreach because he himself was a journalist. One of them had some great tips about author readings, how to excel at author readings. And I really wanted a chance to talk with them about their areas of expertise. And so kind of as a courtesy, I recorded our conversations and I put them out as the first podcast episodes. And then so at that point, it was really like I selfishly wanted to learn for my own purposes. And then in order to pay it back to the community, I was sharing it as a podcast in order to do that. And then as time went on, it became more of a networking outlet for me, continuing to be the idea of paying it forward to people. And eventually, to a certain extent, a money-making opportunity. But I think it's always helpful for guests to understand what drives a podcaster, because it can help you make your pitches more effectively. And so, yeah, I interview anyone in writing and publishing that is able to talk to something that's important to me at the time. I always joke with my listeners that they can tell what I'm struggling with at any moment based on the topics of the conversations I have on the Indy Author Podcast.
Yeah, definitely. I keep saying to my wife that the podcast is my favorite of all my projects. If I could just do the podcast, I would do that full time for sure.
Interesting. What was your impetus for starting it out?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, it was quite similar to yours around the networking. So although I do have books and I'm self-published, my background is more coming from the business side of the books. So I'm not as creative as people like you and most of the people that go to Author Nation. I'm a creative person, but I'm not like sitting there going, typing out books and like writing novels and things like that. I wrote them more as a part of my wider business. So I've got an e-commerce business, which is in the meditation space. And so my first books were all about different types of meditation. And I use them more as products for my business rather than books. So I always say to people, I'm not really an author, I'm more of a publisher. I feel like a bit of a fraud saying that I'm a pure writer, you know. But I still love talking about the craft with people. And that's
Yeah.
so the reason I started this podcast was, you know, a way of becoming more famous, for want of a better word, in this industry, you know, more to network, like you mentioned, to speak to amazing people, to learn more about writing, and just to generally help people who listen to learn more about self-publishing. And when people ask me what my podcast is about, I always say the aim of the podcast is to help people make more money selling books. So that's kind of what I was trying to do, you know, get people to understand that they are not just writing, they're creating more of an author business, and they need to sort of sell themselves and to sell their books and to understand those strategies.
Yeah. That's great. Yeah. Well, that's great. It's a great mission statement.
Yeah. So one of the things, I mean, when we spoke at Author Nation, the talk you had just given was about how to appear on your first podcast. It was about where to find the shows, like how to prepare to appear on them. So why don't you give us a bit of an overview of what that talk was about?
Yeah, well, one of the things I like to start out with is saying that there are many reasons to pursue podcast appearances. I think that there are two things that I think make podcasts really appealing. One is audio content is just intrinsically engaging, that is in a way that is harder to achieve with the written word. Much as it pains me to say that as a writer, but that idea of literally being in someone's ear has the opportunity to create a connection that's just harder to achieve if you were trying to like write a blog post or write an article or even like social media posts and things like that. I'm pretty down on social media at the moment. So I think that podcasts are going to become even more an outlet that people should be pursuing, because I think that social media is losing its effectiveness as a community building and a reader outreach platform. It's something people can do while they're doing other things, which is becoming increasingly important. Yeah. Like I do all my podcast listening while I'm walking my dogs. So, you know, that ability.
Someone said to me the other day on a coaching call, they said, it's weird meeting you in person because you're usually my partner on my dog walks.
Yeah, exactly. And with everybody's busy lives, then that's just a very appealing way of going about it. But what I like to say to people is that before you pitch yourself to podcasts, you should really be a podcast listener, because I strongly believe that people are most successful on the platforms that they enjoy. So if you love TikTok, then TikTok is the perfect way to try to connect with readers. If you hate TikTok, don't bother. Like when TikTok first came out, I looked at it for literally like 45 seconds and I found it just so not me. That I don't think I ever went and looked at it again. And people would say, oh, you know, you're an author, you have to be on TikTok or Book Talk. And I was like, I'd just be awful at it, because if I hate watching it, I'm going to be awful at creating content for it. And I think the same is absolutely true of podcasts to a lesser extent, but I think it's still true that you will be able to do your best performance if you are an enthusiastic podcast listener, because you understand the gestalt, you understand what the expectations are of listeners. And so I think the first requirement is to be, in general, someone who likes to consume audio content. And then I think that the second requirement is to have some familiarity with the podcasts you're pitching. And I think that's not too onerous an assignment, because if you've written a book on meditation, let's say, and now you want to find some places where you can talk about meditation on podcasts, all you have to do is go to your podcast player and type in meditation. You're going to find a whole bunch of podcasts that you not only would love to be on, but probably would also love to listen to. And so the research of this can be quite fun. You know, you just find podcasts that appeal to you as you're wearing your hat of the topic or the genre or whatever it is that you want to represent. And you find the ones that take guests, and that's your initial pool of podcasts that you could pitch.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I think the people that I get, a lot of people contact me, and I've only really just started actually having more strict criteria about the people who came on. We were just chatting about this before, but you know, you've got to 270 episodes, I think you said, and I'm on about 70 at the moment. So it's done really well. But at first, I was like quite desperate to get people on, so I had all these people come on, and I didn't really define that niche properly, whereas now I have quite set criteria. So with your criteria, what are the sort of things that you look for when people come onto the show?
Well, I have refined my criteria to be, it has to be people who have an expertise in a topic related to writing and publishing and have demonstrated that expertise through other podcast appearances. Maybe they've written a book about it. Maybe they've done talks about it. Maybe I've just had a conversation with them about it, and I recognize that they're an expert, and that expertise has to be beyond their own book. And so the reasons for some of those criteria are that beyond their own book is important, because I don't want pitches for people who say, my first book just came out and I'd love to come on the podcast and talk with you about it. Well, there are podcasts that would love that. It's not that that's not a good podcast topic. It's that it's not a good podcast topic for the Indy Author Podcast, because it's not that kind of podcast. Like, that person is looking for a book tour podcast that caters to readers who are interested in that particular genre. But if they can't generalize their experience in a way that is going to be useful to my writer-centric audience, it's not going to be useful. The fact that they've done that in a book or an article or a presentation or whatever that might be is demonstration that they've thought through the topic sufficiently, that they have organized thoughts to share about it. And I'd say that the other criteria is that, there are two other criteria. One is that if they're pitching me because they have a product that they want to share, they have to have information that is going to be valuable to my listeners, regardless of whether they purchase the product or not. Yep. So a perfect example of this is Damon Courtney. I've interviewed Damon Courtney of BookFunnel on the Indy Author Podcast. And we had a long conversation where probably the word BookFunnel didn't come up, or only came up a couple of times, because the agreement was we were going to be talking about cross-promotion and how to use cross-promotion in order to build a network of fellow authors and readers. Yeah. And then at the end, he had an opportunity to talk about how BookFunnel can help readers do that. And so it can't be a sales pitch. It has to be something that is valuable to the readers, even if they don't use the product. And then I'd say that the last criteria that kind of surprises people sometimes is it really helps if I have some personal connection with a person. And the personal connection can be me seeing them do a presentation at Author Nation, or, I've run into them at a conference, or, I know them because they're buddies or whatever. And I do that because that's the background of my recommendation to people, to say that unless you're already a celebrity and people are already going to recognize your name, I don't recommend that people start out trying to find podcast placements through services like, matchmaker services or PR firms and so on, because I can look back, if I were going to rate all 270 episodes of the Indy Author Podcast, the ones that I and my listeners like best are the ones where I already have an established relationship with a guest. Like, I've had Michael Laron on the podcast a bunch of times. Michael and I are friends. We've conducted workshops together. We've co-authored a book. We're co-authoring a new book. I know Michael really well, and those conversations are always super fun, and the listeners love them. And the ones that are the least successful are ones that were pitched to me by a publicist. Yep. And I have nothing in common with the person. They don't know me from Adam. There have been interviews where I've gotten on and it was clear that their publicist just said, click this button at 12 a.m. or 12 p.m. and you're going to be talking with someone on a podcast. And it's just very, very awkward. And so I have almost every once in a while, I just think I'm just not going to take pitches from PR firms anymore. And then I'll have one that's great. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't close that door entirely. But I do think that creating that personal connection, if you're a potential guest and you want to get on a podcast, then getting in touch with someone personally so they can get some sense of what you're like as a person, I think is better than going through a third party.
Yeah, definitely. I think that is absolutely true. I mean, the best interviews I've had have been with people, like you mentioned, I've met in person. But that is quite difficult to do for some people. Some people can't get to Las Vegas. I'm in the UK. It was quite an expensive trip for me. But so there are a couple of services that I've used, and my show is on it. And there's one called Podmatch. So if you are a guest and you're looking to appear, it's a bit like Tinder, but for podcasting. So if you're a guest, as a host, I can see people's profile. And I can either match with, I can swipe left or swipe right. I can either match or discard, whether I think that they're relevant or not. And it was a really good way to get my first guest. And I think if you are just looking to appear on some podcasts, maybe to sharpen your knife a bit and to get better at appearing on podcasts, then these tools are quite good, because they do allow you to get yourself in front of a lot of people. And at least you can start seeing what's working with your profile and what sort of conversations people want to hear about and that sort of thing.
That's a great point. Like, I really like that idea of using it as sort of market research. And early on, when I would talk to people about podcast guesting, there were several services. Podmatch may well have been one of them that offered free services, and you could sign up and you would get like a limited bio, or you could only make so many connections. I can't remember how they limited the free plan. And then the last time I checked, it felt like a lot of the free plans had dropped out and a lot of the paid plans were quite expensive.
Yes.
So I'd just be curious to hear from you about, like, do you recommend people do that and stick with it, or do it for a couple of months if they're looking for podcast placements?
I think it depends what your goal is. So, and I think this is quite important, because for some people, the goal is just to be on lots of podcasts. And, if that is your goal, then a tool like Podmatch is great, because you can just pitch yourself to loads and loads of podcasts really quickly. It's not the best place to find very targeted podcasts that are the right ones for you. Firstly, not every podcast is on there. So it doesn't help me if I want to appear on a podcast that's not on there. But if my aim is just to get on loads of podcasts, then it is a really good tool. But I think it's like $35 a month or something. Yeah, as a host, actually, I earn money when people come. When I found an interview through there, then I earn a small amount of money, like $5 if I interview someone as like commission. But still, as a host, I'm still really picky about who I take from Podmatch, because my first few guests that I found from there, they were good, but some have been maybe not my ideal not my ideal interviewee now.
Yeah.
But yeah, for people who want to just appear on lots, it is a great way to just learn more about all the different podcasts out there and just try appearing on some. I guess one thing to say is you probably don't want to go on your ideal podcast as your first ever one, because you're not that great at being interviewed yet. You haven't refined your message. If you really, if your first ever podcast was like going on Tim Ferriss or something like that, that would be a horrible experience, because you'd feel like you just like wasted that amazing chance that you could have got in front of 100 people, like 100,000 people or something. So
yeah, that's great advice. Start with your C list and work your way up.
Yeah, that is really true. Now, I want to focus more on like what authors can do. Now, I know a lot of the people I speak to is nonfiction, and I think for nonfiction authors, it's quite straightforward to work out exactly where you want to appear, because, for example, with my meditation books, if I wanted to promote those through podcasts, I could search for spirituality podcasts or meditation podcasts. Or, if you're a writer, you could try and appear on business podcasts. A lot of people I hear, there's a lot of business podcasts out there. But for fiction authors, how do you usually advise people where to start with the sorts of podcasts they should be appearing on?
Well, I think it depends on what your goal is. So one obvious goal is to find new readers for your books. And I think the starting point would be, you probably are looking more for book tour podcasts that are specific to your genre. And so I know, I'm in the mystery, thriller, suspense area. If I go onto a podcast platform and search for, mystery podcasts, I'm going to find a whole ton of them. Even sometimes, interestingly enough, you sort of cast the net a little wider than you might think, because I remember speaking to someone who had a true crime podcast, and he had gotten in touch with me and said, I normally interview people about true crimes, but sometimes I like to interview authors who are writing fictional works that are somehow tied in with true crime or based on a true crime or something like that. And I was like, that sounds great. Unfortunately, that's not me, but I had a friend who that was totally her shtick. And so I put the two of them in touch. But I think if you're looking for readers, then, look for those podcasts that are catering to readers of your genre, and all the previous advice about listening to them and understanding the Gestalt applies. I would also recommend that you not just position it as, I just wrote a book and I want to come talk about it. That violates a couple of the rules of pitching, one of which is it doesn't make it clear what's in it for the host or the audience. And so in any communication, this goes way beyond just pitching for podcasts. In any communication where you're asking for someone to help you promote yourself, you have to have what's in it for them. And so you might say, I've been listening to your podcast. I noticed that oftentimes you address topics that are related to a technical innovation or the Cornwall or stories that take place in the desert, whatever that is. And you could say, I have something to offer. Obviously, your audience enjoys this kind of content, and I have something to offer along those lines. I have a book that's set in Cornwall, or, I did research in the Sahara for the fictional work that I wrote on such and such. And so find those ways to connect what you have to offer with the host and their audience, and then have a couple of flavors of that so that you're not just saying, I want to come talk about my book. So for example, one of my books, one of my Ann Kinnear Suspense thrillers, The Falcon and the Owl, has a very heavy backstory in aviation. I myself took flying lessons for many years, and I briefly owned an airplane and got my license for reasons that could be a whole other podcast conversation, but they could be a whole other podcast conversation like that. That's actually my point, that I could pitch a podcast about women in aviation or something like that. And I could say, hey, look, I had this experience. I have stories to tell about it that, I think your audience would like to hear. And, oh, by the way, I have a novel that I wrote based on those experiences that I had. I have a flight instructor in my novel who is really just verbatim my flight instructor. Like the things that the character says are exactly what, my flight instructor would have said to me. And so that angle of aviation or women in aviation, vintage planes, like there are all sorts of angles I could take on that book beyond I wrote a book and I want to come talk about it. So really think through where your book is set, what era it's in. Are there characters who have specific abilities? One of my series has a woman who has some psychic abilities. So, I could play up, do I have that? Do I not have that? Where did I get that idea? So think beyond just, I want to talk about my book, and think about all those facets of your book that might offer an interesting hook into a particular podcast that you want to pitch.
Yeah. My sister's a pilot in the RAF, so she can go on your aviation podcast if you want.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be cool. I mean, you could even, find out something like that. I could make a connection with your sister, and then we could pitch podcasts together and say, look, we have like a wannabe pilot who wrote about it. We have an actual pilot who's doing it. We would love to come on your podcast and talk about that. So yeah, lots of fun things that fiction authors can do to make themselves appealing to podcasts.
The one thing that I found really helpful that sets people apart, and it shows a level of professionalism that I think is much better than just emailing someone and saying, hey, can I appear on your podcast, is a lot of people have a one-pager. Now, this doesn't have to necessarily be like a CV or anything like that. And it doesn't even need to be necessarily a separate document, but it's basically a list of things that you could talk about. And sometimes they even give you questions and talking points for the show and ideas for what the show could be about. And that goes back to your exact points. What are you giving me as an author? Because if I read a one-pager and it says things like, I've got a new book and I can talk about that, then I don't really want to hear about that unless it really is someone that is, quite famous and their new book is, going to be a good book. If it, I spoke to, Kevin J. Anderson and people like that, I don't mind hearing about his new book because obviously his new book is going to be quite a big book. But if I don't want to hear about someone who's their first book and just talk about that, I'd want to hear about what my audience could learn. So for example, on my podcast, if you wanted to come on mine, maybe you've tried a particular marketing tactic that was really successful and it helped you get to the top of the Amazon rankings. That'd be a lovely topic to talk about. That'd be perfect for my show. So when you're creating those one pages, are there any tips you've got for people to help make them stand out a bit?
Well, I actually myself don't. Normally when I get a one pager, it's from a PR firm.
Oh, okay.
So from my own experience, like that's useful. But what I actually find more useful, and I think this is good, it's good advice for hosts and guests, for hosts to be very explicit about how you want to get pitches and for guests to heed that advice. My ideal pitches are the ones that come to me in an email, and the email is quite brief, but it provides links to all the things that I might want to look at, and a one pager online could be one of those things. And so I don't necessarily need to see every platform that somebody has, social media presence on, but it's great for me to be able to click over somewhere, have those links nicely organized, and just be able to click through and see what's going on. A link to their book, ideally not on a specific retail platform, but on their own website. I like to have it all in an email because then it's just right there in my electronic world, and then have links everywhere. And again, that idea that you pave the way by making it as easy for the host as possible, by providing them with questions, like you said, that's a great tip. By putting all the information they might need in one place is a great tip. But I do think that the power of a one sheet like you're describing is that you can use it for purposes beyond podcast appearances. Like if you want to get some media coverage, that kind of one sheet could also be very useful for that. So it would be a great resource to have and applicable in many different areas.
Yeah, definitely. Especially if you're trying to get speaking at conferences and things like that. It's a great way to try and get yourself in front of those audiences. And the people that you speak to, the authors generally, do they have any particular goals that you've seen or any aims they want to get out of being on a podcast apart from just getting on a podcast?
Well, actually, that makes me think of the other goal I wanted to talk about. I was talking earlier about if your goal is to reach more readers, and that's a very, very common goal, especially for fiction authors. For nonfiction authors, there can be other goals like demonstrating expertise in order to get speaking gigs, for example, or you have a consulting service and you want to be able to post some videos of you speaking with people on the topic on your website to encourage clients to engage you for your consulting services. On the nonfiction side, there are all sorts of those examples of you're trying to reach the end, I don't know, the revenue producer, however you want to frame that. But I think another really underappreciated benefit of podcast appearances, and this applies regardless of the kind of book you write, is the connections you can create with the podcast host. And I really think that that's, if people follow our advice and they go out and get podcasts, then if you remember nothing else of what I said about this, it's that don't assume that your work is done when the record light goes out. Because I think back through both the people that I have hosted on my podcast and where I've been a guest on other podcasts, and I think about the things that came out of those relationships as a result of that. So Mark Lefebvre and I co-authored a book about the business side of short fiction based on, me listening to Mark's podcast and being engaged with him as a podcast listener and making that connection. And then Mark has been on the podcast many times. I already mentioned Michael Around and I co-authoring books, and we've been, Michael has been a guest on my podcast many times. And so carry that idea forward of ideally you go into this knowing what you want out of it. You want to reach more readers, whatever that might be, but also keep in mind what you can do for the other person, because thinking of it just very narrowly as that one 30 minutes or 45 minutes or that one interaction, sure, you're going to get benefits out of that, but you're not going to get the same benefits as if you think of it as an opportunity to build a long-term relationship with someone else. I mean, you and I, we met at Author Nation, and then we've had some meetings about some other topics. I think there's some opportunities there, for us to lead our fans and followers to the other person's offerings. So I think, that's another great illustration of the benefits that can accrue to both sides if you approach it in that way.
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the things that always stands out is if you tell the podcast host that you're very happy to share it across your different social medias and especially through your mailing list. Yeah. If you've got an asset that is really good, like if you've got a mailing list of 5,000-10,000 people, then a lot of podcast hosts are going to have you on because that is quite a big audience that you're going to be able to send it to. I did a interview with Dave Chesson from Kindlepreneur, and when he posted that out to his newsletter, it was like it just skewed the rest of my results for the rest of the year because I've got 2,000 views on the first day of it going live or something like that.
Yeah.
When he posted out to his newsletter. So even if your newsletter is not quite as impressive as his, if you've got something that can bring those views in, then that's really going to help, I think.
Yeah, I think that, getting the Dave Chessons of the world is great, but also don't feel discouraged about pursuing podcast appearances if you have a very small following, because a lot of times if I'm assessing a guest, I'm assessing them more on their level of enthusiasm and their engagement. Like I would rather interview someone who has 100 followers on Facebook and they're very engaged with them and their followers are obviously very committed. And there's like a really good connection between the people that they have among their followers and the people I'm trying to reach, all those kinds of things, than to speak with someone who has tens of thousands of followers, but they're obviously not that interested. PR firms.
Yeah.
Or, they're just, maybe they're posting, but they're not engaging. Maybe they're not on the platform at all, even though they're, like the number looks like they have a lot of followers. So yeah, just committing to be really enthusiastic about supporting the podcast and the host that is hosting you, regardless of how big a platform you have. You're going to get a good reputation and you're going to land more appearances as a result.
Definitely. Now, talking about Mark Lefebvre, you've written a book which is coming out soon, all about how to be a good podcast guest. Now, why don't you give us a bit of give us a bit of an overview of exactly what that book's about?
Yeah, well, the first book I wrote about podcasting is Podcasting for Authors. So that's a solo book that I wrote. The subtitle is Creating Connections, Community, and Income. So we've talked a lot about the connections and community part. And there is a part on that about being a good podcast guest. But I found that especially when I went to events like Author Nation and I would talk about podcasting, not surprisingly, a lot of the attendees were like, I don't really want to host a podcast, but, I recognize the value of podcasting. And so I found I was talking more and more about that, and I started pulling together all the tips. We've talked about some of them here, but all those tips that I would share with people who were looking to appear on a podcast. And actually, it was at Author Nation. It was Mark and I got together for lunch, and at Paris, which is next door,
Yeah.
to where Author Nation is held. And we were walking back, and I was telling Mark that I was working on this book, and he said, "Oh, are you interested in co-author?" And I was like, "Yes, in fact, that would be great," because Mark was a great person to partner with, because Mark has not only been acted as host on many podcasts and as a guest on many podcasts, and he also has quite a different approach than I do. And so it was great because by engaging him in the creation of the book, which is called the Podcast Guest Playbook, readers are going to get both our perspectives. And I think we're covering a wider range of approaches and topics than we would if that had ended up being a solo book. So that's going to be coming out a little later this year, probably in spring, early summer of 2025. And it would be great for people who want more of what we've been talking about here to check out the Podcast Guest Playbook.
Yeah, definitely. I might have to send it to all the people that come on this show so I can make sure they're doing it properly when they come on.
Well, it is funny that I've mentioned this to a couple of podcast hosts, and they're very, very excited about it, because I think that exact thing. They do want to mail it out or post it, post a pointer to it on their website or something like that and say, "Yeah, can you read this before you pitch me?" Because, every podcast host gets the cringers, and we all want the experience to be as good as possible for our guests. And so having people understand what those best practices are, I think, is going to be really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, when I have people speak to me about setting up their own podcast, like you mentioned before, I always say to them, before you do that, try and be a guest on some other podcasts, because it's a lot of work setting up your podcast. I think it's more than just speaking to people and getting the guests on. It is there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind that people don't see, and being a guest is much easier because you just got to prepare what you're going to talk about and show up. So I would really say try and be a guest on as many podcasts as you can before setting up your own one, because you might as well just understand exactly what's going on in the ecosystem before you have to start creating your own one for yourself. It's a lot of work.
Yeah, one of the things that Mark and I are including in the Podcast Guest Playbook is there's a chapter saying the host's perspective. And I give a list of the tasks that I have to perform, I or my production assistant need to perform in order to get an episode of the Indy Author Podcast out. I'm like, it's not that you have to understand what's going on at each of these. You just need to understand this. This list is 50 items long. And I think that your point about don't dip your toe in as a host is a really good one.
Yeah, definitely. So when's your book coming out? When are we looking at the release date for that?
Well, it will definitely be out by June. We have a deadline. It's being driven by another podcast appearance that I've already signed up for. Hopefully it will be out a little sooner than that, but in that general time frame.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on, Matty. I think this has been a really interesting conversation, really preparing people how they can become great guests for podcasts and exactly what they need to do to get on more podcasts. If people want to get in contact with you about podcasting or about anything else, where's the best place to do that?
They can go to theindyauthor.com, and that's Indy with a Y, INDY, theindyauthor.com. And if they're interested in learning about my fiction work, they can go to mattydalrymple.com, and that's Matty with a Y, MATTY.
And with your fiction books, where's the best place to start?
Well, I would advise them to start with the first Lizzy Ballard thriller, which is called Rock, Paper, Scissors. The sixth kind of wrap-up book is going to be coming out later this year. And so I'm deep into the Lizzy world, and I'm super excited about that. My other series, the Ann Kinnear Suspense novels, are more standalone. If they're interested in that book that I mentioned about aviation, that's called The Falcon and the Owl, and they can find all those at mattydalrymple.com.
Perfect. I know we were talking about podcasts today, but whilst we're talking about your fiction books, I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. Now, what with Rock, Paper, Scissors and that whole world you've built? You mentioned you've got lots of plans for where that's going. What are you doing with that? What's the plans going forward?
So the sixth book, I think, will wrap up Lizzy's arc. So Lizzy Ballard is a young woman. She's very, very young at the start of the first book, but in most of the series, she's 16 or 17 years old. And due to some nefarious experimentation that was done on her mother at a fertility clinic, Lizzy is able to, or maybe not able to, it sounds too positive, but she can give people strokes with the power of her mind. And so all the books are really about her dealing with that, her family and her allies trying to keep her safe and also keep the people around Lizzy safe from her ability. Lizzy's arc is going to be sort of wrapping up in the sixth book, but there is going to be a spin-off thriller series based on one of the secondary characters. So I'm very excited about that.
Amazing. And have you done any podcast appearances to promote those books whilst you've been writing them?
I have not, probably as much as I should have. And I think this goes back to the idea of participating in the platforms that you enjoy is best. Like, I'm a huge listener of all podcasts about the business side of writing. I'm not a huge listener of like book tour type podcasts.
Yeah.
Unless it's somebody I know, I want to hear about it. And so just in the scheme of things and only having like so many hours of the day and having to pick and choose where I invest my time, I invest my time in terms of podcast appearances much more heavily in promoting my nonfiction work. And I sort of rely on other outlets like social media for promoting my fiction work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but it's good to know that you put your strategy in place, like find the platforms that work for you and just really double down on them. I think that's really good advice.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming, Matty. It's been a great conversation. I think the listeners are going to get loads out of it. And
good. Yeah, this has been fun.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for coming on. I'm looking forward to coming on your podcast soon to talk about ads and things like that. But we'll come back to that later. But thanks for coming on. We'll speak soon.
Sounds great.
Thank you so much for tuning into the Publishing Performance Show. I really hope you found today's episode inspiring. I absolutely love chatting to authors, writers, and people in the publishing world. Now, just before we wrap up, I want to tell you about our Publishing Performance Starter Packs. These are curated episodes and collections organised by topic that makes it super easy to find the exact content you're looking for. So whether you're wanting to deep dive into marketing strategies, explore productivity techniques, or focus on any specific area of publishing, we've organised our episodes into targeted playlists just for you. And you can find these all at teddyagsmith.com. And also, whilst you're here, let me tell you about Publishing Performance. It's the #1 platform for authors who want to increase Amazon book sales but aren't really sure where to start. Now, this show is all about helping you to sell more books, and if you're looking to boost your publishing game and to maximise your book's potential on Amazon, then Publishing Performance is designed to help authors just like you to grow your readership and to reach a much wider audience. Now, I know that Amazon ads can be slightly complicated, which is why Publishing Performance is like having a personalised ad account manager to create your ad campaigns for you, to choose your best keywords and to make adjustments in real time and to optimise them over time to save you money and to make more sales. Now, if you're investing in ads, you really want to make sure your investment is being used effectively, and Publishing Performance does just that. It aims to make your budget go further, improve your organic rank, and target keywords more effectively. You can get started with Amazon ads for free for 30 days at publishingperformance.com, and there's a link in the show notes to get that free 30 days trial.